War for Cybertron was an unfortunate casualty of an era where I didn't finish many games. I started it, I remember enjoying it, but as I had to start doing adult things and got more money, I eventually moved on to a PlayStation 3 and PlayStation 4 after that. Since then, my digital copy on my Xbox 360 has languished, unfinished, and unappreciated, until now. War for Cybertron is cut from a similar cloth as Batman Arkham Asylum, taking a beloved franchise historically translated poorly to games and giving it an injection of love, fandom, and high-octane action, and then dunking it headfirst into the Unreal Engine. Yeah, War for Cybertron is visually a game. Here's the thing, I think it actually kind of looks good, but it also doesn't. The game has a unique art style, creating new designs for iconic characters like Optimus Prime and Megatron that fall somewhere between the Gen 1 cartoon and the bulky action figure heroes of Gears of War. Accompanying the style is a Greeble-heavy Cybertron that covers every aspect of every area. There's variety to the places you see and shoot through, but not much. I'll get to that in a minute. Look, I don't know if War for Cybertron has the best art design, but I think it might be the game from this generation with the most art design. Despite the undersaturated color palette that borders on black and white at times, there's so much visual goodness to feast on, ranging from the large-scale areas and battles to strange ambient alien machinery and set pieces. How much of it will dissolve into plain visual noise depends heavily on how invested you are in the universe of Transformers and the struggles of the Autobots and Decepticons. This is a game for Transformers fans, and if you're not here for that, War for Cybertron might as well just be another shooter. Well, I say it's for Transformers fans, but maybe not the younglings. War for Cybertron came out in an era where being dark and edgy was still cool, so this game does a lot to really try and make you feel like you're in a war. Like it might be one of the darkest T-rated games I've ever played. Remember when Transformers was for babies? Well, here you can execute prisoners of war, there's torture, war crimes, and firing squads. Well, it's still not the worst war crime the franchise has committed, I guess.
I am directly below!
The story is simple, maybe a bit too simple, and divided into two campaigns that you can handle in any order you choose. However, the canon order is Decepticon first, then Autobot, so just do that honestly. There are a lot of cool moments throughout, with the story direction taking heavy influence from Gears. You shoot your way from area to area, with your attention occasionally directed to something that your squad will comment on, with the occasional cutscene and boss to break everything up. The game is also kinda a prequel of sorts, showing how characters like Starscream come to work in Megatron. These moments are neat, but don't do much if you're not a fan of these characters to begin with. Now, the meat of the game is actually just shooting stuff, but being a Transformers game, you'd think there'd be additional gameplay involving transforming, right? Well, kinda. Before each mission, you choose one of three characters, each of whom has their own abilities, ranging from draining health to shields, damage boosts, and more. In gameplay, these differences are slight, but it's a nice consideration that adds to replay value and encourages players to experiment as the team selections change from level to level. Each character also comes with their own weapon, like Megatron's iconic Photon Blaster, etc. During gameplay, you will encounter a variety of weaponry. Unfortunately, for alien robots in a galactic war, the weapon choices are mostly pretty tame. You have your shotguns, SMGs, assault rifles, and then a few slightly more interesting choices like a grenade launcher you can trigger with a button press, a sniping pistol, and an automatic shotgun. The auto shotty is cool and satisfying, but on hard mode it's useless due to its short range. Life is rough when you're a shower, not a grower. Speaking of satisfying, the audio design is great throughout, with each weapon, character, environmental effect, and movement reverberating with cool mechanical precision. It sounds like a bunch of robots clanging and banging, what do you want? Now, you might be saying, okay, but I want to see the Transformers transform in gameplay. And they do. But I kind of feel like the gameplay utility is underwhelming. Each character has a unique transformation with a unique weapon, and the ability to boost and drift around environments. The weapons range from Megatron being an actual tank to Bumblebee's smaller armaments, but for the most part, every Transformer is some kind of floating space tank. Like the slight differences between character abilities when you choose between missions, it is technically adding a bit of gameplay variety, but in practice, the Transformers vehicle mode is little more than a third unchangeable weapon. It is useful, and more importantly, fun to use. There's no cover system to speak of, and with a host of flying enemies and mixed ground units, War for Cybertron feels closer to the gameplay flow of something like Ghostbusters than Gears of War's push-through cover style. You can quickly change from one form to another, zooming quickly between cover or escaping from enemies, only to flank and catch them unaware or just fall back and reload. It's a system that feels polished and works well, but it's hardly all-encompassing and is effectively this game's singular gameplay gimmick that most shooters of this era had. It's just slightly disappointing given how Transformers Devastation would use the ability just a few years later, allowing players to transform to cards and back mid-melee combo, but seeing as how the melee options here are paltry to say the least, it's an understandably bad comparison, I guess. The other big thing in War for Cybertron's gameplay is variety. It's technically there, like with the changing of forms and abilities, but never shifts quite as much as you'd like. There's a host of unique objectives, sniping sequences, turrets, and vehicle mode escapes, but they blend together because you're just shooting fools each time. The biggest variety comes in the form of the Seeker missions, where you take the role of flying Autobots or Decepticons who have their own gameplay style and transformations that allow you to fly in 3D space, lock onto enemies for aerial dogfights, and have unlimited vehicle ammo. These sections work great, they have an amazing sense of scale and feel tight and fun each time you take control. Flying ability also allows for more distinct environmental variety. When you can fly, you don't need constant ground, and the environment team gets pretty creative with some of the resulting encounters. The problem is, between the 10 or so missions, you get 2 of these. And that's not to say the rest of the game is bad, far from it. The gunplay is fluid and satisfying, the non-cover-based gameplay is refreshing and fast-paced, and the game's pacing of story and objectives does a good job of depicting the desperation, fear, and brutality of war. But there's so damn much of it. Like, I was constantly driven forward by the scale and scope the game reached for, the impressive set pieces and battles, and seeing iconic characters throughout. It's a treat for fans of the franchise or just fans of big, epic games. But by the time it ended, I felt exhausted, more than ready to jump back in for another go. There are other issues throughout, particularly with ammo being incredibly sparse in some areas. The game's limited color palette can also affect visibility, especially in larger areas where the Unreal Engine gets all Silent Hill on your ass so your field of vision blurs up like Goro Majima with beer goggles. But overall, War for Cybertron is a satisfying shooter with good variety, memorable encounters, and impressive presentation. Doesn't always stick the landing when it comes to variety, but it's still absolutely worth playing for casual shooter fans looking for a heaping dose of that good old-fashioned Unreal Engine, and is especially a must-play for any Transformers fan looking for a faithful adaptation, despite how gritty and violent it can be. Oh, wait. This game doesn't let you play as RC at all. So never mind, this game can get fucked. Eat Lead is a game known primarily for one thing, being a limp parody of gaming. In the satirically minded third-person cover shooter, you play as an aging gaming hero, Matt Hazard, a Duke Nukem-esque action white man who needs to escape from various pastiches of his own gaming past to defeat the CEO of a gaming company that owns him. It's like a reverse Tron if Tron was played by Will Arnett. It's an interesting premise, right? You've got voice talent, you've got a unique idea for a game, you've got Neil Patrick Harris as the villain. Okay, maybe not the biggest selling point, but it's something for a budget shooter from 2008. The thing with Matt Hazard is that the concept is the best thing about it, but that also might make it more interesting in retrospect. I'll talk about that in a minute. The first thing you'll notice is that the gunplay just isn't very good. There's no heft to the handling, the weapon sounds feel like they come from a stock asset library, and they lack impact, and the enemies simply ragdoll to the ground when they take the required amount of damage. There's a fairly detailed cover system that works surprisingly well with polished transition animations and all the bells and whistles like popping in and blind firing, but you rarely need to use its full potential to surmount the game's challenges. Eat Lead threatens to have a good weapon selection. You've got water guns, laser rifles, 6-shooters, grenade launchers, and more, but it's ultimately all pulled from the same stock. The laser rifle has a charged shot, there's a sniper rifle, but by and large, you're playing with some variation of an SMG and a pistol throughout the entire game. Annoyingly, you start every level with a pistol. You swap soon enough, but it's still a minor quibble. Oh, and the grenade launcher is useless, because if it doesn't hit a target directly, it takes so long to explode, they'll just have moved away. You do get a little gameplay gimmick, of course. As you kill enemies, you power up an upgrade meter that lets you shoot in either ice or fire damage, with ice being the most useful to mow down groups of enemies. It's actually pretty satisfying, but it's far from being enough to distract from the banality of the rest of the shooting gameplay. The biggest problem in Eat Lead's gameplay, however, is the enemy AI. As you go through levels, Matt will fight a variety of different enemy motifs, including zombies, cowboys, ninjas with water guns, and probably the most unique, 2D sprites from a parody Wolfenstein game that actually dodge your fire by turning sideways so they're too thin to shoot. There's so much potential for interesting encounter design, weapon variety, and more here, and the game uses none of it. Every enemy you fight follows the same simple AI pattern of rushing you from cover and kind of flanking. The AI is your garden variety stupid, and often find themselves shooting each other, getting stuck in cover, or going the wrong way. The zombies are the sole exception, as they just saunter to you wherever you are until they're put down with a headshot. The game had a pretty medium T rating, so while you get the parody of games like Wolfenstein, Resident Evil, and others, they're fairly toothless as homages go. So far, Eat Lead probably sounds not very good. It's not an atrocity, but just kinda there. And that is 100% correct cookie for you. But that's also kind of why I like it so much. See, in being a mediocre third-person shooter that pokes fun at games in the industry, and in particular the history of the shooter genre, Eat Lead transcends itself. When it came out, it was just another bland shooter with a misused premise. But now, after playing so many games just like it, Eat Lead is somehow refreshing in its simplicity and nonchalance. It doesn't take itself seriously, it's not very good, but like a bad nu metal album from 2007, you still find yourself drawn to it, tempted by memories of sweeter, stupider times. In a way, Eat Lead could be released today, just as it is, and would be welcomed by some. But that's the thing. Nobody would want to make a game that is intentionally lacking in just the ways Eat Lead is. It's perfectly emblematic of an era and ripe as a parody because it's so mediocre. It can't be replicated by someone trying to make a lame game, because it's just genuinely one of them. It's unintentionally brilliant in that way, almost like some kind of accidental performance art. It's a self-parody, a lame shooter with mediocre mechanics, unmemorable environments, and tepid storytelling. And yet, I find myself going back to check off the stereotypical kill 20 enemies with this gun achievements, and I'm having a good time? Part of this is the engaging premise, but unfortunately, Eat Lead's low-budget faults are evident throughout. It never takes advantage of that premise, never straying too far from staple environments of modern shooters like warehouses, yachts, and tropical villas. And when it does, it's usually not engaging or very polished, like a multi-wave boss fight against a kraken on a pirate ship aping the beginning of God of War 2. The most standout moment in the game, and something that genuinely almost approaches brilliance, is a boss fight against this JRPG twink where the cutie has to select his moves from a menu like Final Fantasy, and you have to shoot down enemies and even things like healing orbs as he summons them. It's clever and preceded by some fun jabs at video game staples that haven't changed much in their relevance. Also, I just want this cutie to take me and fuck. These parodies are the best thing Eat Lead has to offer. Watching an aging action hero sardonically traipse through parodies of Metal Gear Solid, Halo, Mario, and more has aged like fine milk, but is again reminiscent of a simpler time, when things like Robot Chicken were considered the height of internet comedy. None of the jabs are particularly scathing, so it all comes off as a fairly good-natured jaunt. But these vignettes also reveal where the game is most lacking: the budget. They're missed opportunities. They feel like each cameo was meant for something more that had to be cut and replaced with more shooting of generic gaming goons. One missed opportunity, for example, sees you running from a drone to help a wizard in a warehouse. Good setup for a boss fight. But as you unbox a magical stick, thinking it might finally be an exciting fireball weapon, you get a cutscene of the wizard defeating the drone. You never get the fireball stick, that's the end of the level. There are countless little moments like this throughout, where you'll meet a Mario impersonator or a master chef, like Master Chief, get it? And then they just have a one-liner and go. Will Arnett actually does a really great job squeezing some chuckles out of the material here, and he's easily the standout part of this game, most worth seeing it through for. His delivery alone takes some really lame jokes and punches them up just enough. But when the jokes and cutscene are over, you're back to just shooting the same dudes in different skins with slightly different weapons. The environmental lack of variety also stings. You get cameos from sci-fi, horror, fantasy, and platformer genres, but visit the same boring locales you've seen dozens of times before. Where's a level in a castle? Where's the level in a parody Mushroom Kingdom? I don't think the team lacked creativity. Moments like the Kraken fight and the JRPG battle proved that they had a vision. Hell, even the nutso concept and the enemy variety prove they had a larger scope in mind. But Eat Lead just feels constrained, too ambitious for its own premise, and settling for mediocrity as a result. Probably the worst offense of an obvious constrained scope are the QTE boss fights, which sees you pressing buttons to just fight bosses. It's never challenging, it's not very fun, and though the sequences can be good for some laughs, it's yet another reminder of how Eat Lead disappoints with its own setup. Still, I'd say I enjoyed this game, which, let me be clear, Eat Lead is mediocre as all hell, but there's something about it. It's perfect in that mediocrity, a shining example of a bygone era of shooter design that, unlike its contemporaries in blandness, is never too hard or edgy or cringy. It doesn't take itself seriously, even poking fun at staples like achievements for quick goofs and gags throughout. There's something admirable about it, and adding the fact that it's good for a few laughs thanks to the voice talent, it's breezy. Revisiting it is like the perfect way to revisit the feeling of renting a game from Blockbuster, beating it in a session or two, then forgetting about it. But for the time you play it, you can just turn off your brain and engage with the silliness. If you're a sociopath like me, Eat Lead might be the shining example of a completely tepid game you should pop in if you want to revisit this bygone era of shooter design, just to shoot some dudes for a few hours. Is it a classic? Hell no. The shooting isn't even very good. But taken on its own terms, there's something almost magical about how dumb and lackluster it is. There's this idea that in video games, sequels are for improvement, for taking a core concept and iterating on it. Some of the greatest games of all time have been sequels, taking the promising conceits of their initial entry and stripping away the parts that didn't work while refining those that did. The list of legendary games in this mold is long: Street Fighter 2, Resident Evil 2, Gears of War 2, Modern Warfare 2, Mass Effect 2. And you know what else? Dead Space 2. I was impressed by how well the first Dead Space held up. Despite dragging in some parts and having some wonky objectives and bland bits of storytelling, it remains an engaging action horror game. But blow it out your airlock because Dead Space 2 stomps the first game to death and doesn't stop until it gives up that sweet, sweet loot. There isn't a single aspect of the game that hasn't been improved. From the first cutscene, Dead Space 2 feels tightly authored, an intentionally crafted vision from front to back. Isaac is back, but this time with a voice. He awakens on a massive floating space city called the Sprawl, with another necromorph outbreak unfolding and a head full of hallucinations from his encounter with the Marker. What follows is a well-paced story of survival that manages to turn Isaac into an actually identifiable character. While the overall yarn moves from point to point, keeping players in line with a series of intensifying objectives, Isaac's internal struggle with the Marker is much more human and cutting than I remember. He's a man broken by the circumstances thrust onto him, but struggling to let go of things that tied him to tragedy because they might be the only good things he has left. I found myself really engaging towards the end, but the improved storytelling is easily the least of Dead Space 2's improvements. Now look, I always remember Dead Space 2 looking good, but goddamn! Every tool Visceral used in Dead Space 1 is ratcheted up in the sequel. Colors are more diverse, using bright pop art in mall-like sections, atmospheric stained glass in churches, and haunting primary colors all over an abandoned space elementary school. The game has its fair share of industrial corridors and repair bays to stomp through, but even these have been given a greater visual variety with more intensely saturated lighting and environmental set pieces. The result is that every area you visit is memorable in some way or another. And this isn't even mentioning the improved character models, animations, textures, like the grimy necromorphs. Accompanied by more advanced shadows, Dead Space 2 manages to be a visual marvel over a decade later, no doubt aided by a fairly linear presentation that manages to hide loading better than the first game. Though there are still your fair share of loading elevators. The audio design also warrants special notice. Every aspect of the audio presentation here stands out, whether it's the satisfying splorches of crushing mutated tendon and bone with a screen-shaking melee attack, or the ambient machinery and scenery around you. Some of the most intense moments are ironically the quietest, when Isaac finds himself in the vacuum of space with nothing but the dull thuds of hitting things to accompany him. Unlike the purely industrial setting of the Ishimura, Dead Space 2's The Sprawl allows for some expansive world building in its varied biomes. You traverse hospitals, apartments, churches, all the while coming across environmental storytelling and logs that flesh out interesting concepts like what commercialism, childcare, and family-like look in a spacefaring corporation-ruled future. Of particular note is the previously mentioned childcare facility. Look, I've seen a lot of factories, warehouses, and jungles on this series, so I like to call out originality where I see it, and Zombie Baby Kindergarten Gymnasium School Play Jamboree is such a buck-wild concept, it deserves a spot in the batshit shooter environment Hall of Fame next to Gears of War 2's open heart surgery on a giant space worm. Don't worry, I'll get there in that series someday. Dead Space's gameplay succeeded largely on enemy variety, and that trend is continued with an expanded roster. Plenty of clever monster designs return, but the newest additions, like the raptor-like stalkers, cause the most tension. They'll attack from every angle, forcing players to stay on their toes when they hear their telltale screech. But even more impressive is how encounter variety is leveraged throughout. Dead Space 2 trims the fat from the first game, which means no repetitive boss fights, and no turret sections. Instead, the game focuses on delivering challenging and incredibly intentionally crafted combat sequences that always feel rewarding to overcome. The core of Dead Space's already solid gameplay has also been improved. Most important touch-up comes to the telekinesis powers, with more objects around to skewer enemies, allowing for even greater improvised combat in the heat of the moment. Check out this sweet kill I got after skewering a necromorph with a mop. Hey, clean up on aisle dead, bitch! There are just plenty of other great bits of game design throughout that tie gameplay and narrative together in smart ways. The return to the Ishimura in particular is a genius bit. Originally, years ago, I played Dead Space 2 first, but Dead Space 1 more when I was younger, so returning to these games in order has been a treat for reasons like this. When you eventually board the Ishimura to activate the ship's gravity tethers, you actually follow the same pathway as Isaac's first journey aboard. Though instead of retreading the same ambushes and combat encounters, Dead Space 2 turns them on their head, preying on the player's memory and expectations to deliver some really high-tension and memorable gameplay. And that is a pretty good encapsulation of what makes the whole game so good and memorable, to be honest. Dead Space 2, played after so long and set against its predecessor in a decade of contemporary shooters and horror games, is one of the most perfect specimens I've ever seen. Every part of the machine works as intended, from combat to pacing, environments, presentation, and even the story. Gaming sequels have a long history of delivering all-time classics in the wake of promising first entries, and Dead Space 2 is one hell of a banger. There's no reason I can think of why somebody shouldn't play it, even after more than a decade. Don't like shooters? Play it on easy. Don't like horror? Play it with the lights on. Don't play video games? Dead Space 2 is the kind of game that will make you want to learn.